All right, everyone. It was inevitable. The long and awaited review of How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibra X. Kendi. Here we go. National Book Award winner, author of Stamped from the Beginning, #1 New York Times bestseller. Now, it would be very easy to just go in and completely lampoon this book and to lampoon Kendi, and I think I've already done that in one video, and I will do more videos where I do that more, because not only is that entirely easy and just asking for it, it's also very appropriate with his personality, the way he approaches politics and political discussion and political debate. Ridiculing him, mocking him is all fine. In this video, I'm going to be honest, I won't be able to resist doing some of that, but I want to try and actually talk about the book some. So as you can see, it's not a very long book. I think it runs 300 something pages. Yeah, less than 300 pages. Yeah, 250. Last page is 241 actually, and it's with, big type, lots of spaces. So this is, a couple days, couple sittings if you really get into it. So the way that the book is laid out is basically autobiographical. It's basically a story of his life, with each chapter broken up into a different episode in his life, and then those episodes interspersed with his biography, or his autobiography in this case, and some aspect of his philosophy on anti-racism. And Kendi is, as Coleman Hughes says in his debate, what he lacks in intellectual rigor and scholarship, he makes up for in candor. He will just come out and say things that I think a lot of people think, but they realize sounds really bad, and so they never actually say. So he goes through, and basically it's a litany of all the racism that he's suffered over his life, which is, debatable that it's any. The most explicit episode he really talks about is when he was in third grade. He thought that the teacher didn't call, he didn't even say on him as much, but on some of the other black students enough, and therefore she must have been racist and he was being oppressed. But he lays out his philosophy of anti-racism, which basically is that there's no such thing as not racist. If you listen to his interviews, and I've spent the last few weeks listening to as many of them as I could, both in terms of finding them and then stomach listening to them, is the idea that there's no such thing as not racist. Every single action, every single policy is either pro-racism or racist or anti-racist, and there is no middle ground. And this is literally, he is actually quite explicit about this, that everything is either or. It's racist or anti-racist. It doesn't matter what the policy is. And this was explicitly asked of him in one interview. He was interviewed on Ezra Klein's podcast, and he said a capital gains tax, and he's like, no, that would be a racist policy. And the other way that he measures it is there's a kind of a conflation of racist or anti-racist and equity in terms of outcome. So anything. It's actually interesting the way that he defines racism, because the way that he defines it is a racism is a policy that has inequitable outcomes. So any policy that has any inequitable outcomes is by definition, racial outcomes is by definition racist. And on top of that, racism is only from policies. So what's interesting here is, like, if you were to have a case of the Ku Klux Klan riding up and murdering somebody for being black, it's not clear to me that would even meet his definition of racism, because that's not a policy, right? That's just individuals. And there's another interesting part of his philosophy here, which is that he's very clear that you can't condemn individuals or cultures. Individuality has apparently no place in his system. If you are poor, if you are out of work, if you're a drug addict, if you're a criminal, all that stuff is just doesn't reflect anything other than the system. That's always the fault of the system. And presumably also any success you have is also the result of the system. So there's essentially zero agency in here. Now, that's interesting because in the book, he talks about his own agency changing. His ideas did evolve from, as he would put it, anti-black racism. So when he was initially growing up, he was very race conscious, even as a child. He talks about his parents. It's clear that he is he subtly rebukes his parents for not staying college ideologues their entire lives. Both of his parents were in the so-called black liberation or the church liberation movement. These are people who were nominally Christians. They believed in Christianity, but they would be like, the foundation of Christianity is Jesus is a revolutionary, and probably a lot of these people, Jesus must be black. And I'm not even going to get into that, but it's just part of their philosophy. And he talks about his dad being like a poet and his mom being a missionary who would go to Africa to spread revolutionary Christian theology in Africa. And there's a part where he clearly is like upset that, his father's not still a poet, and that his mother isn't still a missionary of radical black Christianity in Africa. And he rebukes them for settling down, getting good jobs, supporting their family. It's very clear that he thinks that was somehow a missed opportunity or something that prevented them from reaching their true fulfillment. It's subtle, but it's definitely there. And then it's basically going through his life. And, so initially he was very black conscious of his skin. This is why in his third grade, he's criticizing the teacher for not calling him off. And, I have no idea. Maybe his teacher was racist. Maybe she wasn't. Maybe she did, or maybe she didn't call on the kids more or less. And maybe there were other reasons for that. That's the other issue here, is that it's assumed that if there's inequity, it must be because of racism, right? So if if there's any kind of outcome difference, then that must be racism. It's assumed that it must be racist. Not only that, racist policies. And later, when he got into high school, he got more into this zone of being kind of a little bit anti-black racist. And so in the sense that he looked at people and he used the terms them niggers, like something that, so-called, I don't know how you would say this, but middle class African Americans who do well, who have jobs, who nothing that they do contributes in any way to crime or poverty or anything like that. Who they've done well for themselves. They often, and I think he's actually has a point here, incorrectly look at other African Americans who don't do that and who quote unquote give them a bad name, as if, as a white person, I feel ashamed when I see white trash people. I don't. And to the extent that African Americans feel that way, I agree with Kendi. That's a silly thing to say. So it's actually interesting. There are things in here that I would agree with. He's not completely wrong. But he talks about internalizing that. And then also he gets into the anti-African racism. So African immigrants or Africans and African Americans don't always coalesce very well. From the many African Americans look at immigrant Africans as, you're the people who sold me into slavery. He, to his credit, acknowledges that was a thing, that Africans were the ones capturing and enslaving and then selling to Europeans, something that is omitted whenever I've had this discussion with somebody in real life. That's just a basic fact, like a historical truism that is completely omitted in the narrative, and he has it in there. And he talks about how many African men, look, your grandfather sold my grandfather into slavery. On the other hand, a lot of immigrant Africans, and there's trouble there, because when you have immigrants, you have a selection bias anyway. That's the most go-getting people, the people who are really motivated and all that, who become immigrants. Even if they're poor, they become immigrants, and so it's not a good population to compare. But they look down on African Americans as being lazy and criminal and all these other things. And he had a phase where he bought into that, and he didn't like African immigrants, and he also didn't like poor blacks. And I'll say, in my experience, when I was in college, I worked at a fast food restaurant, and almost all the employees were African immigrants, primarily from Mali, Senegal, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, places like that, all former French colonies, all spoke French, Bambara, Kai, a couple other African languages. And they were very clear that they did not identify with African Americans. They didn't hate them all or anything like that. It wasn't like they were racist, but there were things about them that they really did not like. In general, not literally all the time, but they're like, I don't see myself as with them. And the thing is, many African Americans feel the same way about them. Now, at one point in Kendi's life, he felt the same. Now, he eventually got past that. Then he gets into the idea of, can minorities be racist? Now, this is something that most people on the woke left will deny. And they have this formulation where power, for something to be racist, it has to be, you know, a bigotry or discrimination, but with power, and black people don't have power. And he ably deconstructs that in at least two ways. He goes, well, actually, a lot of black people do have power. I mean, we did have a black president. We do have black people in Congress. We do have black mayors. We do have black millionaires. We have black billionaires. Not many, but there are some. And lots of black people who are cops and who are police chiefs and who are mayors and city councilmen and all the whole thing. And so to say that he goes, they have disproportionately less power than he thinks that they should, but they don't have none. But when he says blacks can be racist, most of the time what he means is they can be racist against other blacks. And so the people that he singles out as the most racist blacks are Clarence Thomas. He really obviously hates Clarence Thomas. And Thomas Sowell gets one mention as being obviously racist against black people. And he even, it's so bad, he talks, and one good thing about the book is he does make historical reference. Now, his historical scholarship is terrible, it's awful. It's complete cherry picking. It's overlooking stuff. It's omitting things like crazy. I'll get into a good example of that just to kind of illustrate in a bit here. But he'll talk about how he talks about a slave revolt, in a big slave revolt in South Carolina that was thwarted by a slave who informed, I think it was Delaware Plessy or Denmark Plessy, something like that. I can't remember the name, excuse me. It's not an episode I'm super familiar with myself, so credit to him for bringing it to our attention. Although you have to, it's like he gets a name, and it's like you definitely need to look that up yourself. Because if he makes a reference, he could twist, contort, omit, make up, reinterpret in a way that completely misrepresents. That doesn't say he always does that, but you need to take that with a grain of salt, right? It's like the first time, you hear somebody make a huge error, okay, I got to pay extra close attention. But he talks about, I think it's a slave turned in this slave revolt. As a libertarian, as a freedom, slave revolt is ethically completely justified, and a slave who squeals on them, I can understand the incentives or whatever, but yeah, that's really bad. And yet, in his mind, in his conception, Clarence Thomas is worse than that slave. Clarence Thomas is worse than the slave who turned in other slaves who all got executed, right, to curry favor with the slave masters, with his own oppressors, right? The ultimate Quisling, the ultimate Stockholm syndrome, the ultimate traitor, and Clarence Thomas is worse than that, because Clarence Thomas has power and he has these things. Same with Thomas Sowell, same with a couple other guys. So then he gets into college, and he attended all-black college in Florida. He talks about how much he loves the marching band. And clearly there's all this, he's got a lot of personal stuff in there that doesn't really need the birth for the narrative, but he wants to use the opportunity to explain to you how much he loved the marching band and whatnot. And he talks about, and I'd heard this reference before, and I was like, that can't really be true. He went through a stage where he believed in the Nation of Islam. He was very interested. I don't know if he believed, he was very interested. And he quotes Malcolm X a lot in the book, who is a thinker and an activist, orders of magnitude above what Kendi will ever be, just throwing that out there. And everyone should go read his autobiography of Malcolm X. Excellent book and fascinating man. But if you're at all familiar with the Nation of Islam cosmology and theology, it's completely bonkers. It was invented in the 30s out of whole cloth, completely fabricated, and it was descended. It only worked for audiences who didn't know anything about history or geography or religion, right? And there was this idea that everyone was originally black, and some evil scientist named Yaqub created an island. I think it was in the Aegean Sea somewhere, and bred white people out of gorillas, and then white people, right? And I remember encountering those ideas for the first time and just thinking, look, I've read enough about like ancient Greece, and there's people who are experts on ancient Greece, and they don't they don't reference Jakub or any of, like, it's not in the Odyssey or the Iliad. It's not in any of the writings of Herodotus or Pliny or Plutarch or Livy or anybody. So where's it? Just seems to, and none, and there's no apparent black hole where they're omitting some kind of fundamental truth like that. So I'm like, you would have to just be completely ignorant of all that to even entertain that idea, and yet Kendi did as a college guy. And later he read somewhere on the internet that white people are aliens, and you want to forgive somebody for believing something. Most people have had dumb ideas at one point or another, but he's in college, he's trying to be a scholar, and he's the kind of guy that when he sees something that matches his bias or his bigotry, which at that time was very anti-white, he personally was very much offended by the 2000 election, and that was a stolen election from Al Gore, as if it was stolen from black people. I mean, as if Al Gore is not also white, but and you can think that. I mean, look, corruption in elections, totally valid thing. Corruption in that particular election, absolutely valid thing. Corruption in all the elections, absolutely a valid thing. But to then think that white people are aliens for a while, it's not clear how long, but he actually believed that. Another interesting thing is that he correlates, one of his overarching ideas is that racism doesn't come from ignorance or bigotry, it comes from self-interest. People are racist because it's in their self-interest. How exactly it benefits everyone is unclear. I mean, he talks a lot about how, well, for the elites, yes, racism helps white people, but for your average white person, racism doesn't really help them and it hurts them. An equitable society would be better in every way, in which case, why are they racist then, right? If that is true, if it's based on self-interest, then if it's not helping them, if it's detrimental to them, why are they doing it? And if you say, well, it's the ideology, but that's not, you're not saying that they are brainwashed to be racist or that it's propaganda. It's because of self-interest. And another interesting thing there is, like, one of the things is you can't not be racist, and this idea that it's because of self-interest you can't change, and yet his opinion changed from anti-black to anti-white to not racist. He would never say not racist, anti-racist. He became an anti-racist over this evolution. But one of the main ways he evolved is by interacting with other people. And he has many chapters, especially when he gets into college. He has his token friend who is my trans friend, my gay friend, my Native American friend, my immigrant friend, right? And they all have a role in bringing him enlightenment. But it's very interesting because as a white person, if you were to go and say, well, I have black friends, I have gay friends, I have a trans friend, that would mean nothing to him. And yet he uses that, like, he has that same tokenism in his own defense. I've become woke, I've become awakened to the struggles of feminism and queer theory and all that. And he's one of those who believes very strongly in the use of the term Latinx, even though no Latin people really like that term, to show how enlightened he is. But he became enlightened by interacting with these people. So, but if you come and say, well, I married a black person, or I date a black person, or I'm friends with them, wouldn't do anything. Now, the worst chapter by far is his chapter on capitalism. So if I were to ask you, who founded capitalism? There's lots of answers you could give, and you could even make the most nuanced response would be, well, nobody invented capitalism. I mean, the name itself, the term capitalism, comes from Marx, but a good person you might want, maybe Adam Smith. That's a really good example. 1776, Adam Smith. Maybe David Ricardo. Maybe John Baptiste Say. Maybe Bastiat. Maybe Mises. Maybe you want to name the founder of the Dutch East India Company, or the founder of the Muscovy Company, the first or the founder of the Central Bank of England, or something like that. No, he picks. If you haven't read the book, you would never be able to guess. He picks Henry the Navigator, and that is because he has created this construction that capitalism and racism are conjoined twins. This is a formulation that he loves so much that he can't resist using it repeatedly. And I guess the idea is if he keeps saying that they're conjoined twins, that they are. Now, the capitalism that he describes, what he's using capitalism as like a shorthand for the North Atlantic slave trade. And that's why he picks Henry the Navigator, because that's when the Portuguese started really exploring Africa on their own, and that's when they first started purchasing slaves, even before Columbus had sailed to the New World, right? And the way that he gets there is by clear cherry picking and omissions. It is his contention that there was no racism in the world prior to that. Now, concepts of race are very different now than they were in the past, right? We are in the post-Darwinian age. People did not have that kind of concept of biology that we had, but people could still be racist against other people. In fact, it's almost like a truism among anthropologists that almost every group, every tribal group, every band, every clan has some kind of xenophobia where we're the real people and everybody else is not the people. I mean, certainly the case with, I mean, you could go to Papua New Guinea, you could go to Africa, you could go to North America. You know, it's very common that you'll hear, and it's almost always presented as like, oh, look at this neat little factoid. According to, you know, in this tribe, the name of their tribe isn't tribe, it's the people, and then everyone else is, you know, the alien other. But it's like everybody does it. In fact, it's societies that don't do that stand out as being very unusual. And yet he talks about like that never happened until Henry the Navigator. The other interesting thing about this formulation of capitalism is that if it's based on the North Atlantic slave trade or the Atlantic slave trade and the mercantilism of the period, the 1450s, you're talking about feudalism. I mean, that's not even early modern yet. And then you have the mercantilist period. And most people say that's not even capitalism. But if you want to say that's what it is, then that's over. Like if capitalism is defined in the way that he did, then capitalism ended 200 years ago at least. So it's a very forced formulation, and again, completely cherry picking, completely based on omitting all other references to, you know, anything that would be considered racism, lumping it all together into one period and one group. You know, like he'll acknowledge that slavery was a thing, you know, to his credit, I guess. I mean, you get the impression from a lot of these writers that slavery never existed before, you know, the Confederacy was founded. But that the slavery from before wasn't racial, and so therefore not capitalist, I guess. I mean, like when the Romans were rounding up hundreds of thousands of slaves from Gaul and selling them for money and becoming financially, you know, super wealthy potentates in their own right. Was that not capitalism? Like, was that not slavery? I mean, it was obviously slavery, and they weren't enslaving other Romans; they were enslaving other ethnicities. So, again, that chapter is extremely weak. I've never heard anyone say Henry the Navigator was the creator of capitalism. Nobody believes that. No one thinks that. That's completely his own innovation there, but one that he just will not let go. And there's a lot of interesting things in terms of his personal life, because if you look at it, he says everything that's capitalist is racist. It's not like capitalism can lead to racism or capitalism can help racism, or, you know, they're connected in some kind of vague way. They are the same thing. They are conflated and equivocated as one and the same. Capitalism is racism, racism is capitalism. And the only way to be anti-racist is to be anti-capitalist and to go for equity. Equity of outcomes, not equity of opportunity, not equity of rights, equity of outcome. And I'd like to point out that, like, Kendi makes $20,000 an hour as a speaker. Kendi has been given millions of dollars by Jack Dorsey of Twitter. And if you read the acknowledgments in his book, let me go find them, worth reading. This is take a second, but it's worth it. Oh. I must also acknowledge all the great folks in production, sales, marketing, and publicity at Random House, especially my fellow Eagle, Maria, so that's the school he went to. Random House, is that a socialist, equitable commune, or is that a profitable corporation? It's a profitable corporation. And Kendi, you know, what's the math on this? Let's say he does $20,000 an hour, right? Sorry, guys, I'll just do $20,000, 1, 2, 3, times 8 hours a day. It's $160,000 a day. Say he does 5 days a week. That's $800,000 a week. and he's a professor, so he doesn't work all year. So let's say that instead of working 52 weeks a year, let's say he works 40 weeks. Okay, that's $32 million a year. Okay, so where does that put him? Is that equal? And the other thing too is, how is that not capitalist, right? How is Random House a capitalist? He's a capitalist, and he's also very clear that any inequity is from policy, and any inequity is also from racism, and that's clear inequity. $32 million a year, that's the rate. Now maybe he doesn't work that much. I don't know how much he's making from the book. It's the best-selling book, so I'm not talking about royalties. I'm talking about how much he charges. So I mean, he got his organization anyway got $10 million from Jack Dorsey in just one donation, right? So let's just say I'm being ridiculous, and let's just cut that 10 times, so $3.2 million a year, which seems very, very, very plausible. That's not equity, and that is capitalism. And that means it's racist. The other thing too, there's a very interesting trope in the book that all cultures are equal and all cultures are exactly the same, and that all cultures are equal, and you cannot criticize any culture. In which case, I don't know what the basis of criticizing a culture for being racist is, right? If it's all the same, he's not going to criticize burning brides. He's not going to criticize foot binding. He's not going to criticize female genital mutilation. He's not going to criticize male genital mutilation. He's not going to criticize executing homosexuals. He's not going to criticize anything about any culture at all, except if it's racist in his view. So I don't know. That's a clear inconsistency there that he never addresses or even seems to be aware of. The other huge stretch is the idea that cultures can be different, which he acknowledges, but yet those cultural differences cannot possibly explain differences in outcome. Differences of outcome must be from racism. It's just axiomatically the case. And that just doesn't make any sense. Like if you have a culture that says that you should drink and not work and be lazy and be homicidal and, versus one that doesn't, that says you should be studious and hardworking and honest and save, right? We don't need to say that one culture is better than the other, right? And that's another thing is he strawmans his arguments by saying, well, people say inferior, superior. You don't have to say that. I'm not making a value judgment. I'm just saying those differences are going to result in terms of material outcomes, and that's fine. Thomas Sowell, who, let's see, do I have, yes. One second. I'll get a nice palette to Kendi's book here in a second. Culture can definitely affect this. And different populations can have different cultures. And he uses in his example Japanese Americans and Puerto Rican Americans. And he's not saying he hates Puerto Ricans or he loves Japanese people. But the average age of the average Japanese American is 20 years older than the average age of the average Puerto Rican American. Now, I don't know if that's true right now, but it was true at one point. Right? So, this is a culture. The cultures vary. And they have different birth rates and different longevity, and so you end up with that. And how on earth are you going to have any equal outcomes with such a disparity, right? So a population that's 20 years younger on average is going to have the same earnings as a population that's 20 years older, or the same education level, or the same home ownership rates, or anything. No, this is just completely it defies any kind of reasonable reaction or assumption to think that culture can have no effect. Never mind getting into biology, which again, he blames biology on racism. So one of the things as the story progresses, he talks about, and I learned this from watching his videos. I hadn't really known it before, but he gets cancer. He gets colon cancer when he's 35. And that was 2 years ago, or maybe 3 years ago now. And, he has so far survived. And he talks about how, one of the reasons the United States is racist is that, black people don't survive cancer as much. But in the book, he talks about his father getting cancer and surviving, his mother getting cancer and surviving, his wife getting cancer and surviving. He gets cancer and survives. seems like black people in America and his family, the medical care in the United States is perfectly capable of saving all of them, as it has. And they all have fairly, I don't know about his father. It sounds like his father had prostate cancer, but his mother and his wife both had breast cancer, and he had colon cancer, which are all pretty serious. He had stage 4 metastatic cancer. He implies heavily that the reason he got cancer was studying racism. That all that, when he was doing research for Stamp from the Beginning, his previous book before this one, where he did all of his quote-unquote historical research into racism, the history of racism, which he just started with Henry the Navigator so he could line it up with the North Atlantic slave trade, that was filling him up and making him really sick, and then he gets colon cancer, and then he survives, which again, by his own reasoning, is not an equitable outcome. You know, at least someone in his family should have died, and the fact that they didn't is inequity, and that inequity can only be caused by policy, and that policy must be racist. So to give some examples here of some of the omissions he makes, he talks, for instance, about capitalism is racist because look at the black unemployment rate, and he goes, blacks have been consistently had higher unemployment than whites going back 50 years. Okay, it sounds like a great talking point, but then the question becomes, well, wait a second. What about before 50 years ago, right, when we were more capitalist? I mean, he's not arguing that we weren't capitalists before that. According to him, capitalism started in the 1450s, and it's still ongoing. So 50 years ago was definitely still capitalism. The last 50 years, you know, that's only, 1/8 of that period. So why does he stop it there? It's because the black unemployment rate was the same as the white unemployment rate for a very, very long time, probably going back to right after the end of slavery. So, you know, it's completely omitting all that facts and just, let's cherry pick. We'll just start counting here and not counting. That's the same thing. The reason why he's starting slavery, why racism starts with Henry the Navigator, so he can pin. And, you know, this is something that Marxists have been doing for a long time. I forget the name, but there was a professor in the 30s in the Caribbean, I want to say in Barbados, who wrote, you know, basically the North Atlantic slave trade created capitalism as we know it, which is stupid and false and makes no sense, because if that was true, then capitalism should not have started in England or in Lowell, Massachusetts, but rather in Lisbon or Brazil or the Roman Empire or the Greek Empire or anywhere else where slavery existed, not in places where it didn't exist and was only tangentially related to, right? Why was the Industrial Revolution in Lowell? I know where it started. I've been there. It's Lowell, Massachusetts. It's 20 miles from where I am right now, right down the Merrimack River. Slavery had been outlawed in Massachusetts 50 years before that and was not common before that. So why didn't it start in Mississippi or Alabama, right? Doesn't make any sense. And the timing doesn't work either. If the Industrial Revolution starts in 1800, but the slave trade started in 1450, again, I made videos to that effect. Dieter McCloskey has written to that effect. Don Boudreau has articles about that. It's a completely ridiculous argument, but one that, you know, so another really good example here is he talks about the Trayvon Martin case. You know, he's big on, like, here are black bodies getting destroyed, and he talks about Trayvon Martin's just a kid, and he's walking through, and he and Zimmerman getting, you know, somehow they encounter each other, and then he goes, and nobody will ever know what happens, but at the end, Trayvon is dead. And yet, in the trial, there was a witness. It happened in front of someone's house, and that somebody called the cops, and there's a 911 call where he describes what's happening, and what's happening is Trayvon Martin is beating the crap out of George Zimmerman, excuse me, and he testified in court, which is why Zimmerman was acquitted. And not only that, and this is like some tiny detail, he wrote a book about it. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, yeah. You can look it up yourself. This was like, look, I know I'm not a serious scholar like Kendi, but The Reluctant Witness, How the Tragic Event Between Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman Changed My Life by Jonathan Good and James LeGrand. And if you want to get even more details, I highly recommend the book and or the documentary, or both. They're by the same people, The Trayvon Hoax. But the fact that he words it that way and says, well, no one will ever know. I'm like, oh, except for the witness who called 911. You can actually hear in the background the scuffle going on. You can hear Zimmerman screaming for help. And this guy, Jonathan Good, tells Trayvon, stop or I'm going to call the police. And Trayvon doesn't stop. Well, if someone tells you that stop or I'm going to call the police and you don't stop, you are fucking asking for it. And I don't know if Kendi just doesn't know that or if he's directly admitting he's either a terrible scholar, which, okay, he is obviously, or he's lying, and I think he definitely lies some of the time. So, if that's the level of his, and look, this isn't, when was that? This is 2014, 2015? No, it's like 2013 or 2014. I think it's 2014. Okay. He can't get that right. And that's super well documented, but he's going to give us this great dissertation about Henry the Navigator. Please. So, yeah. So then the book ends when he survives cancer so far. I guess I should say I'll wish him the best, but not really. I'm sure he suffered a lot, but he's inflicting a lot of suffering too. So it's weird that his whole family got it too. And it's interesting because the attitude that he has is one where you can't criticize anybody for their personal family. Like no amount of drug use, no amount of alcoholism, no amount of lethargy, no amount of criminality. That is never your fault. And on the flip side, any success above average is the result of not only policy, but definitionally racist policy. Again, so I don't know what he must just be giving away all of his wealth. Maybe he donates all those $20,000 an hour that he gets from big corporations, right? When he does that, it's not because he does a GoFundMe and a bunch of poor people come and pay him. It's because a huge corporation, a capitalist corporation, a for-profit capitalist corporation pays him to do that. So I don't know how that's not inequity and not a racist policy by his own. It isn't to me, but by his logic, it is. It's fascinating. And here's the other thing. There was something when I first started, reading the book and watching and listening to interviews with him. In one of the interviews, one of the researchers is talking about how she's obviously met him before. They know each other in some capacity on the lecture circuit, at least. Not that they're personal friends. And it was before he wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's when he was doing the tour on Stamped from the Beginning. And she was complaining, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to end all this racism? And he, the way she describes the story, he sits back, he crosses his hands, and he's like, I'm working on it. And the fruit of that work is this book. And there was something about that really, really bothered me. And after listening to all the interviews that I've heard, and I haven't listened to everything that's out there, so maybe I missed something. I have never heard any hostile questions or hard questions. I've never heard him taken to task by an interviewer or anybody in the audience. And he absolutely categorically refuses to engage with anyone. And I think now you can go look an open letter to Ibram Kendi by Coleman Hughes, where Coleman Hughes says, let's talk about these disagreements. We obviously disagree. Let's talk about it. And Kendi absolutely will not do it. Not with Coleman Hughes, not with Glenn Lowry, not with, not that Thomas Sowell would dying to do it, but, he'd never even dream of it. Not if Clarence Thomas, somebody that Kendi, cascades as the most evil black person ever, probably, even more than someone who turns in a slave revolt, deigns to debate him, he wouldn't do it. He won't debate anyone. He won't even take a question from the audience. And what bothers me is you have a guy who's this cocky, self-assured, I know the answer to everything, but I'm so insecure about that answer that I can't defend it from anyone. Like I couldn't, not one question from an audience member. And that's a whole other function. Ivan the Heathen posted on one of my other videos about him recently that there's something, a moral exculpation of like these progressive white liberals who they're not stupid necessarily, and they can see that this guy is not erudite. I mean, the way he speaks, like he can't say secession. It's always succession. Okay, maybe that's a quibble, but whatever. But they sit through it, and it's almost like I'm going to flagellate myself and there's something about like this black man talking down to me constantly and telling me that there's an original sin that I can never extirpate no matter what. Which, by the way, is a completely self-interested thing for him to say. Right? He profits off of this, and he makes it very clear, very, very clear, that people are motivated by self-interest. Now, his understanding of self-interest is, I would say, fairly limited. I mean, it's even more limited to someone like Ayn Rand, because you can be self-interested and be like, look, yeah, money's great, but I get more psychic benefit from the advancement of a particular cause or a particular charity, and that doesn't factor into his mind at all. But these audiences just are complete sycophants to him, and they're just, why am I so racist? What can I do? You're the best. And that's what all he'll do. But then he has this self-assured, I know what's best I know the solution to all this is a 600-year problem. And I wrote the 241-page book that solves that problem so easily, because all we need is to have exact equity everywhere, right? Yeah, that's fucking easy. Like, where did he like go to college? The Venus Project Institute University? No, he went to a primarily black school. So, he in Florida. And what's interesting too is, like, he believes in affirmative action, and he believes that it shouldn't be based on merit, that the answer to discrimination in the past is discrimination in the present. So he's also admitting, like, look, my credentials don't mean anything. And they shouldn't. I should just be given this by right, because he had such a rough life growing up with, two parents who paid for everything and took care of him. And he just fostered these racial resentments. He also talks about, this was hilarious. So, he talks about this traumatic example when he's in third grade and the third grade teacher doesn't call on him. He talks about another example when he's in high school in New York. He's from Queens. And a black student on the bus pulls a gun on him, pokes it in his ribs, and starts threatening him. And did this repeatedly. And that registered as, well, that's the fault of racism. That's not his fault. That doesn't reflect badly on him. That is just a reflection of racism. But when a teacher doesn't call on him, that's like this horrible horror episode that he just won't shut the fuck up. Like, he got cancer from studying racism in the 15th century, but a classmate pulling a gun on him repeatedly and sticking it in his ribs, and it's the way he describes it. It doesn't sound like this person was deliberately trying to kill him, but just had a gun and was being a fucking, just pushing people around just to get his shits and giggles. That's still, I mean, that's serious assault. Like, that's a serious crime, and seriously fucked up. And yet Kendi's like, well, he was a victim himself, and I'm not going to judge him. I'm not going to judge any of them, but I'm going to judge my third grade teacher who, when he threw a fit when she didn't call on a little black girl. And let's even assume that his story is completely accurate there, and he wasn't just a third grader misrepresenting things. I mean, look, third graders are fucking stupid. I remember when I was in, not third grade, but like first grade, we had a game where we would go on the merry-go-round and we'd spin it and we would yell where we were going to go, like it was a spaceship and it was going to take us someplace. And we would yell, like, we're going to Beach Planet or Nintendo Planet or whatever. And they didn't pick the planet I wanted to go to. And, I wanted to go to Pizza Planet because pizza's the best. And I was so upset I started crying. And I ran to, like, the lady in charge of the playground. I was like, they won't go to Pizza Planet. It's not fair. Okay, I was a fucking kid. And that bigotry was not the result of a policy of racism and suppression. I bring it up now only to juxtapose. He takes a very similar, well, you could say, well, it's a teacher, but like it's a third grade teacher. Who gives a fuck? Like, but then someone jabs a gun in his ribs. He's like, yeah, it's fine. So he's also a big basketball fan. And I'm like, well, I don't know if he knows this, but like the NBA is not equitable, right? First of all, their salaries aren't equitable. Second of all, they don't have racial parity at all, right? There's a huge overrepresentation of African Americans. So what? We need a policy to restrict that, to make it equal? And is that policy a result of racism? There's a racist policy that's making the NBA full of black people. And he talks about the NBA a lot, and he's a Knicks fan, and how at one point he tries out for a basketball team in high school, and he doesn't make it, and he's all upset. And I was waiting for him to say that, well, it's because they were racist against black people. He doesn't say it, but but then he says that studying racism gave him colon cancer. So I'm kind of shocked that he didn't actually do that, but he never brings that up. He never. There's so many. I wrote a couple. I didn't quote everything. I didn't want to mark up such a nice book. Let's see. To be anti-racist is to think nothing is behaviorally wrong or right, inferior or superior with any of the racial groups. Okay, so then there's nothing wrong with racism then, right? Is there any other way to read that? Like, not just the kind of racism we have today. He talks about, he doesn't like the term microaggression because he goes, it's not microaggression, it's racial abuse if you ask somebody where they're from or compliment them on their afro. But you read this, to be anti-racist is to think nothing is behaviorally wrong or right, inferior or superior with any of the racial groups. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with white people then. Nothing. Even if they're 100 times more racist than he alleges, there's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with racism. It's right there. I circled it because it was so stupid. Don't take my word. Page 105. Is there any way to read that? It's the first sentence in the paragraph. Whenever an anti-racist sees individuals behaving positively or negatively, the anti-racist sees exactly that, individuals behaving positively or negatively, not representative of the whole waste. Except if she's my third grade teacher. To be anti-racist is to de-racialize behavior and remove the tattooed stereotypes from every racialized body. Behavior is something humans do, not races do. Unless they're white races. Then that's policy. Come on. Focus. There we go. So this does not exonerate all. I mean, he does use it to exonerate everything else. You'll never catch him criticizing Islam, any of the various forms, for anything, no matter how many gays they execute or women they clitorectomize, right? Or Chinese aborting girls. Of course, I'm sure he would be totally in favor of abortion, but or anything, right? Except for white racism. Let's see, what are these other ones? These must have been good if I report 128. Boop, boop, boop. Ooh, that looks good. To be anti-racist is to see ordinary white people as the frequent victimizers of people of color and the frequent victims of racist power. Okay. Oh, wait, there's more. The only thing wrong with white people is when they embrace racist ideas and policies and then deny their ideas and policies are racist. So if you deny something is racist, that's a problem. I didn't see the irony. See if there's anything slightly ironic and contradictory about this next phrase based on the previous quote. We must separate the warlike, greedy, bigoted, and individualistic cultures of modern empire and racial capitalism, more on that later, from the cultures of white people. But I thought all cultures are equal in every way. But ours is warlike, greedy, bigoted, and individualist cultures of modern empire. Look, I'll even grant like the warlike. I agree with that. But that doesn't sound like a neutral description of a culture, that they're all the same. Yeah. 133. He really doesn't like Donald Trump. So this is a Senegalese scholar that he became influenced by the name of Cheikh Anta Diop. Diop's two cradle theory suggested the harsh climate and lack of resources in the northern cradle nurtured in Europeans barbaric, individualistic, materialistic, and warlike behaviors, which brought destruction to the world. Right, like destruction, like plumbing and airplanes and medicine and technology and universities and Marxism. Right. Okay. The amenable climate and abundance of resources in the southern cradle nurtured the African behaviors of community, spirituality, equanimity, and peace, which brought civilization to the world. And then he goes, I blended Diop's environmental determinism with Michael Bradley's version of the same in his theory, the Iceman inheritance. Okay. Why isn't he speaking, Bambara? Why is this written in English? Why did they use a Gutenberg text? Why did they print this? How do they circulate it? On the internet? Or by signal fires? Or by foot carrier? Like Shaka Zulu would send somebody, in the 1800s, in the early 1800s, like on foot to bring a message, right? Maybe that's what civilized the world when Shaka Zulu, massacred millions of his own people. That spread peace and prosperity around. How could you read that and not find it completely stupid in every way? You have to be completely ignorant of everything, to read something like that. Like this is this funny thing with ignorant people, and we're all ignorant to some extent, right? A wise person understands that they are ignorant about a lot of things, and that when they read something for the first time, maybe they should take it with a grain of salt. An idiot will think, I just read something, and it's about something I don't know anything about, but now I'm an expert, and my understanding of that surpasses all other people. And that's what you have to be to read something like that and find it compelling, which he did and maybe still does. He didn't actually ever disown that statement at any point later in the book. And I remember even, again, I remember going to a Barnes & Noble when I was maybe 12 and finding a book. It was titled Black Spark, White Flame. I'm sure it wasn't by Diop, but it seemed like it was very similar to that. The idea that civilization started in Africa, which, that's debatable. Maybe it did, especially if you're going to count Egypt as Africa, which, you should. I mean, it is part of Africa. Maybe it's distinct from Southern Sahara Africa, but yeah, it's still Africa. Most people say it's in the Fertile Crescent, but it's not that far away, and it's debatable. But even as like a 12-year-old, no, that doesn't. What? Like there's civilizations all over, like in the Indus River Valley, in the Yangtze, in the Yellow River Valley in China, in the Americas, and that's just all. No, it really just started in Africa, and we just don't have any evidence of any of it, right? They just somehow they started and they were way better in every way, but somehow the Europeans just became technologically vastly superior to them, somehow. And not just the Europeans, everybody else actually. The Chinese, the Indians, right? Everybody but the North and South Americans, pretty much. Let's see, 43. So he's talking about black on black criminals like Blackwell. So Blackwell was, I think, the Secretary of State for Ohio who helped get Bush elected, right? So that's black on black crime. Shooting a black person is not black on black crime in comparison. What Blackwell did is much worse, right? Killing a black person, aborting a black baby is fine. Like that's not. But Blackwell, get away with their racism. Black people call them Uncle Tom, sellouts, Oreos, puppets, everything but the right thing. Racist. Black people need to do more than revoke their black cards, as we call it. We need to paste the racist card on their foreheads for all the world to see. This includes Thomas Sowell, Clarence Thomas, John McWhorter, right? Like Glenn Lowry, Coleman Hughes, Frederick Douglass. Like everybody who doesn't agree with him is a racist, right? And it sounds like it's so simplistic that linked unitary, you must be being like hyperbolic. No, I'm not, because it's a perfect dichotomy. Everything is racist or anti-racist, and any policy that causes inequity is racist. And here's the thing: there is no policy, none, that has an equal result, none, except for killing everyone, like exterminating. That there is equality in death, I suppose, right? So the closest society ever would be like the Nazis, because they equally killed, right, a huge number of people. They treated Jews equally. An equitable outcome, right? He says we need to have anti-racist policies, and it says stuff like universal healthcare, but universal healthcare will not provide equal outcomes for everyone, right? We have universal healthcare in all these white countries, by the way, like Norway and Sweden, and they don't have equal outcomes for everyone. For one thing, they don't treat cancer very well. Their cancer survival rates are way worse. He got way better cancer treatment here than he would ever get there, but I guess he would be more happy if it was equal. Then this is a common thing with Marxists and socialists. Margaret Thatcher pointed this out brilliantly. They would rather everyone be more poor as long as there was less differentiation, right? If everybody got better, if everybody was richer, if everyone's standard of living got at least twice as good, right? Let's say the absolute poorest people in the world doubled or tripled, 10 times got better. But the richest 1% got 11 times better, then Kendi would hate it and call it racist. But if everybody was reduced to 1/10 the poorest person, but everybody at that same level, that they would be happy then. That's their philosophy. It's explicit. How is that not insane? It's insane to have those kind of morals, but even more insane that how are you going to achieve that? There's nothing. Read The Great Leveler. There's no way to do these things. None. And it's also far from obvious that you should. And what does that even have to do with racism? And again, by his definition, a Klan attack on a black person that ends up in their lynching is not really racism because it's not a policy, right? So Kendi is a work, and it's actually a fascinating cultural phenomenon that he has risen as far and as fast as he has. He clearly has successfully branded himself in a way to assuage the conscience of the progressives of this country, and they have just fawned and swallowed and bent over in the most catamite way possible to this guy. And he's a terrible speaker. His writing is terrible. He's not one half as clever as he thinks he is, and he doesn't even think he's that clever, I don't believe. And his book is complete garbage. Are there things in there that aren't terrible? Yeah, there's a couple things, but not much. I would, it's good to know these things because people bandy this stuff about. But like and I recommend people watch Coleman Hughes's breakdown of the review of the book too, because he does break down. Compared to the other critical race theory stuff, there's a lot less jargon in Kendi's writing. Maybe he's just not adequately familiar with it, perhaps. And so it's much more readable than say, Derek Bell or Crenshaw or some of these other ones. I think he's about the same as D'Angelo as far as that goes, but it's just asinine. So I wanted to end this on a positive note. So if you really want to read something that's thought-provoking and based on reason and evidence and empiricism and using well-argued points, Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, an International Perspective by Thomas Sowell. Somebody who does more intellectually valuable research in an hour than Kendi will ever do in his entire life, even if he doesn't relapse and die of cancer. So read the 2. And this is what Kendi's, I think, third or fourth book. This is like Soul's like 40th book. Soul's older, so that's fair. Soul, by the way, grew up in Jim Crow. Soul actually experienced racism in a way that went way beyond his teacher not calling on him when he was in 3rd grade. Right. So I'll probably do one more Kendi video, and then I'll move on to some other stuff. I'm still going to do some other authors. I will say Ta-Nehisi Coates is probably going to be up there next, and Critical Race Theory, which I've started already, but I haven't finished because it's really boring. And I'll say, at least for Coates, not that I'm not as familiar with him as I am with Kendi at this point, but Coates, at the very least, will get on stage and will argue with people. He will debate, which is much more than can be said for Kendi. So anyway, I hope you guys all enjoyed this review. Hope you're doing very well, and have a great night. Goodbye.